They say vampires are mythical creatures, just old stories about beings that feed on the living. But for thousands of years, people across the world have reported encounters with them. Could there be truth behind the myth? Long before movies, long before Dracula, long before pale aristocrats in black capes became symbols of seduction and immortality, people feared the dead could return. Not as ghosts, not as spirits, but as something physical, something hungry. Across Europe, entire villages once lived in terror of corpses rising from their graves. Families dug up loved ones. Bodies were burned in the middle of the night. Stakes were hammered through human hearts, while priests whispered prayers over the screams of terrified villagers. And perhaps the reason these stories survived for so long is because the people who experienced them never doubted what they had seen. To entire villages across Europe, vampires were not fantasy. They were something feared as deeply as disease, death, or the devil himself. In Serbia, reports spread of dead men returning from their graves to feed on the living. In Eastern Europe, entire communities became consumed by fear after mysterious illnesses swept through villages, and bodies were found strangely preserved beneath the soil. Some believed evil could survive death itself. Others believed certain people were cursed long before they ever entered the grave. And the fear became so intense that governments, priests, and scholars began documenting these cases as if they were dealing with a genuine threat. Tonight, we travel back into the darkness where the legend began. Into plague-ridden villages hidden beneath mountain fog. Into ancient burial rituals. Into the terrifying nights when Europe hunted the dead. This is the true origin of vampires. The modern vampire is elegant, beautiful, controlled, almost romantic. But the original vampires were nothing like that. The first vampire legends were grotesque. Bloated corpses with darkened skin, bodies swollen with blood and gas. Creatures said to claw their way out of graves to suffocate relatives in their sleep. The origins of vampire mythology stretch back thousands of years, long before Eastern Europe gave the creature its modern form. Nearly every ancient civilization feared the restless dead. In Mesopotamia, there were stories of demonic entities that drank blood and preyed upon the living at night. Some scholars connect these creatures to the ancient demon Lilitu, one of the earliest supernatural figures associated with seduction, darkness, and feeding upon humans. Ancient Greece feared beings known as the Vrikolakas. Unlike modern vampires, the Vrikolakas was not seductive. It was a walking corpse, a body that refused to decay properly. Villagers believed these creatures knocked on doors at night. If someone answered before the second knock, death would follow soon after. Even Rome had tales of blood-drinking spirits. And in ancient India and China, legends described corpse-like beings feeding on life force and blood. Humanity, across continents and centuries, seemed obsessed with the same terrifying idea. The dead do not always stay dead. But why? Part of the answer lies in something deeply human: fear of decomposition. Before modern medicine, death itself was mysterious. Corpses changed in horrifying ways after burial. Skin darkened, hair appeared to grow, fingernails looked longer, bodies bloated from internal gases. Sometimes blood leaked from the mouth. To medieval villagers, these were not natural processes. They were signs of feeding. Signs the corpse had become undead. And when disease swept through isolated villages, people searched desperately for explanations. If an entire family died one after another, surely something was attacking them. Something returning from the grave. The vampire became the answer. Or perhaps it was never just an answer. Perhaps it was a recognition. Something people across continents and centuries kept encountering, independently, without contact with one another, and could not explain any other way. The true birthplace of the modern vampire legend lies deep within Eastern Europe, especially in regions like Serbia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and parts of the Balkans. And during the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe entered what historians now call the vampire panic. Entire villages became convinced that vampires were hunting them. The fear spread like a plague. One of the most infamous cases began in Serbia in the early 1700s. A man named Petar Blagojević had died. Shortly afterward, villagers claimed he returned from the grave at night to attack the living. 9 people reportedly died shortly after claiming Blagojević had returned to them in the night. Terrified villagers dug up his body. According to official Austrian records, the corpse appeared strangely preserved. Fresh blood was said to flow from the mouth. Hair and nails seemed to have grown. The villagers drove a stake through his chest. Witnesses claimed the body groaned. Then they burned it. The Austrian officials who documented this case were not superstitious villagers. They were educated men of government, and they could not explain what they had seen. Just a few years later came another famous case. Arnold Paule, a Serbian soldier who reportedly claimed he had once been attacked by a vampire. After his death, villagers believed he too returned from the grave. Soon, multiple deaths followed. Authorities became involved. And this is what makes these stories so chilling. These were not simply folk tales whispered around campfires. Government officials documented them. Military doctors examined bodies. Reports spread through Europe. For the first time, educated society began debating whether vampires could actually exist. The hysteria became so widespread that emperors and church leaders eventually intervened to stop the panic. But by then, the vampire had already entered European consciousness forever. The old rituals surrounding vampires were horrifying, because people truly believed they worked. Throughout Eastern Europe, there were many ways to stop the undead. Some methods changed depending on the region. Others appeared again and again across centuries. The most famous, of course, was the wooden stake through the heart. But this was not originally symbolic. Villagers believed the corpse physically moved at night. Pinning it to the earth prevented it from rising. Sometimes iron stakes were used instead of wood. Other times the corpse was decapitated. Heads were placed between the legs. Mouths were stuffed with garlic, bricks, stones, or holy wafers. In some graves discovered by archaeologists today, skeletons have been found buried with sickles across their throats, designed to cut off the head if the corpse tried to rise. People scattered poppy seeds or rice around graves because they believed vampires suffered from compulsive counting. The creature would supposedly stop to count every grain until sunrise destroyed it. Garlic became another famous defense. Not because it smelled unpleasant, but because it was believed to possess protective spiritual power. Religious symbols were also used constantly. Crosses, holy water, prayers, church bells. The vampire was not merely seen as a monster. It was viewed as something spiritually corrupted, a being trapped between life and death. And perhaps the darkest part of all, sometimes the accused vampire was someone villagers once loved. A husband, a daughter, a neighbor. Fear turned grief into horror. Imagine digging up someone you buried weeks earlier and believing the body beneath the soil was responsible for the deaths of your family. That terror shaped Europe for centuries. No historical figure is more associated with vampires than Vlad the Impaler. But before we talk about monsters, we need to talk about the man. Because the real Vlad Dracula was not a creature of the night. He was something Europe found equally terrifying. A human being with absolute power and no mercy. Vlad was born in the 15th century in Wallachia, a small, desperate kingdom caught between collapsing empires and the relentless expansion of the Ottomans. Violence shaped him before he was old enough to choose it. As a child, he and his brother were taken hostage by the Ottomans as part of a political agreement meant to keep his father loyal. There, historians believe, Vlad witnessed executions, torture, and the ruthless machinery of empire long before he ever held power himself. His father belonged to a secretive military order, the Order of the Dragon. In Romanian, the word for dragon was dracul, but over time the word carried a second meaning: the devil. Vlad became known as Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. And when he finally seized power in Wallachia, Europe would remember that name in blood. Vlad ruled through terror. Absolute, calculated, deliberate terror. His preferred method of execution was impalement, forcing victims onto enormous wooden stakes designed to pierce slowly through the body while keeping organs intact for as long as possible. Death could take hours, sometimes days. Travelers described entire fields outside his cities filled with thousands of impaled corpses twisting in the wind. A forest of the dead. German pamphlets spread across Europe describing him as a monster wearing human skin, a ruler who burned the sick, executed the poor, and destroyed entire villages as a warning to others. Some accounts claimed he ate dinner among his impaled victims, that he dipped bread into their blood. Historians debate how much of this was deliberate propaganda spread by his political enemies. But even during his own lifetime, the fear was real. Because Vlad understood something most rulers of his era did not. Fear, applied correctly, could replace an army. And yet, in Romania, some still remember him differently. Not as a monster, but as a protector. A brutal man making brutal decisions in a brutal age, fighting desperately to hold a small kingdom together against one of the most powerful empires in the world. That contradiction is part of what made him so unforgettable. Because Vlad was not monstrous in the way legends are monstrous. He was worse. He was human. He died in battle sometime around 1476. His head, according to some accounts, was sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. And that should have been the end of Vlad Dracula. A brutal ruler in a brutal century, remembered by historians, forgotten by everyone else. But centuries later, a writer in Victorian London came across his name in an old book. And everything changed. Here is something most people never learn. Bram Stoker's Dracula, the most famous vampire in history, was probably not based on Vlad the Impaler at all. That connection, the one the entire world now accepts as historical fact, was built largely by scholars and filmmakers decades after Stoker's death. The real story of how Dracula was born is far more interesting. In the 1890s, Bram Stoker was a theatre manager in London. In his spare time, he had spent years quietly researching a novel about an ancient evil hiding in a crumbling castle in Eastern Europe. He visited libraries. He filled notebooks with folklore, superstitions, and legends about the undead. He studied vampire beliefs from Serbia, Romania, and the Balkans, the bloated corpses, the stakes, the terrified villages, the official government reports. And then, in one of those notebooks, he came across a name: Dracula. He found it in a book about Wallachian history. The name stopped him immediately. Dark syllables, ancient weight, something that sounded like it had survived far too long. Stoker wrote it down and built his villain around it. But here is what those same notebooks reveal. Stoker knew almost nothing about the historical Vlad. The man who impaled thousands, the ruler who turned fear into a weapon, the prince whose brutality shocked even a brutal century. Almost none of that appears in Stoker's research. What Stoker actually drew from was folklore. Vampire legends, burial superstitions, stories about the restless dead returning to feed on the living. He took the name Dracula because it sounded perfect. Not because Vlad was a vampire, not because history demanded the connection, but because some names carry darkness inside them, that no explanation can fully account for. The firm connection between Vlad the Impaler and vampire mythology came much later. In 1972, two historians named Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally published a book called In Search of Dracula, arguing that Stoker had deliberately modeled his vampire on the historical Vlad. The argument spread everywhere. Into films, into documentaries, into classrooms, into popular culture. And eventually, it became accepted as fact. But many modern scholars believe Stoker's connection to Vlad was far less direct than popular culture later suggested. Which means the most famous vampire in history shares a name with a real historical ruler, almost by accident. And yet, the novel itself changed everything. Before Dracula, vampires in folklore were grotesque, bloated corpses with darkened skin, bodies swollen with gas, rotting things clawing their way from graves. But Count Dracula was something entirely different. He was intelligent, cultured, patient. He wore fine clothes, spoke with elegance, moved through high society completely unnoticed. And somehow, that made him even more terrifying. Because Dracula did not look dead, he looked alive. Too alive. There was something unnatural hiding beneath his perfect manners and calm eyes. He could charm people before destroying them, hypnotize them, manipulate them emotionally, long before he ever touched their throat. For Victorian readers, this was a specific kind of horror. Because Dracula represented fears that polite society barely dared to speak aloud. Sexual temptation, disease spreading through intimacy, foreign corruption entering the home undetected, ancient evil disguised as civilization. The vampire was no longer a corpse rotting in a graveyard. Now it was a predator capable of entering your bedroom, your mind, and your desires, while looking perfectly respectable at dinner the night before. Readers became obsessed. Some were disturbed by the violence, others by its strange erotic undertones. Many could not stop talking about the Count himself, this immortal aristocrat who seemed simultaneously monstrous and seductive. And perhaps that was the moment the vampire truly became immortal. Not in a castle in Transylvania, but in the imagination of every reader who finished that novel and felt, somewhere underneath the rational part of their mind, that something about it felt true. After Dracula, the creature no longer belonged only to folklore. Now it belonged to everyone. And the name Vlad Dracula, a man who died in battle 6 centuries ago, whose head was probably displayed as a trophy, became permanently attached to immortality. Through myth, not through history, which in its own dark way is exactly what he would have wanted. Bram Stoker gave the world a name. Hollywood gave it a face. And in doing so, it buried the original vampire almost completely. The bloated corpses, the terrified villages, the official government reports, the real folklore that had survived for centuries across Eastern Europe. All of it slowly disappeared beneath something far more powerful than superstition. A story people actually wanted to believe. In 1922, a German filmmaker created the first vampire film, Nosferatu. And Count Orlok, its vampire, looked nothing like the elegant aristocrat Stoker had imagined. He was bald, skeletal, rat-like, a creature that seemed to carry disease inside him simply by existing. Wherever Orlok traveled, sickness followed. Ships ran aground with dead crews, cities emptied, entire populations collapsed beneath his shadow. This was not a seductive monster. This was plague given a face. And audiences in 1922 understood that fear completely, because they had just lived through it. The Spanish flu had killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide just 4 years earlier. Entire families wiped out, cities paralyzed, death arriving silently and without warning. Nosferatu did not invent that fear. It simply gave it a shape. Then came Hollywood. And Hollywood wanted something different. In 1931, Bela Lugosi stepped onto the screen as Dracula and transformed the vampire forever. Gone was the rotting corpse, gone was the plague metaphor. In its place stood something far more dangerous to 1930s audiences. A charming foreigner with hypnotic eyes and perfect manners who could walk into your home uninvited and destroy everything you loved. For Depression-era America, that hit differently than any monster ever had. Because the real fears of the 1930s were not supernatural. They were human. Economic collapse, political instability, the slow, creeping sense that the world as people knew it was ending, and that forces beyond their control were responsible. Dracula embodied all of it. Ancient, powerful, utterly indifferent to ordinary people's suffering, and charming enough that you might not notice until it was far too late. But something interesting happened as the decades passed. The vampire began to change. Not just in appearance, in meaning. 1976's Interview with the Vampire, originally a novel by Anne Rice, later a film, did something radical. It gave the vampire a conscience. Its vampires did not revel in what they were. They suffered. They grieved. They spent centuries watching everyone they loved disappear while they remained frozen in time, unable to age, unable to die, unable to feel fully human anymore. Immortality, Rice argued, was not a gift. It was a prison sentence with no possibility of release. And audiences responded to that idea in a way nobody had quite expected. Because the 1970s and 1980s were decades obsessed with identity, with what it meant to be different, with the loneliness of existing outside the boundaries of what society considered normal. The vampire became a mirror for that loneliness. Not a monster to be destroyed. A tragic figure to be understood. That shift opened a door that popular culture has never fully closed. Buffy the Vampire Slayer turned vampires into complex characters capable of love, guilt, and redemption. Some were monsters. Others fought desperately against their own nature. The line between predator and victim blurred completely. True Blood explored what happens when monsters demand civil rights. When the thing society fears most refuses to stay hidden and asks, with complete sincerity, to simply exist openly alongside everyone else. Twilight removed the horror almost entirely and replaced it with something the original Folklore would have found completely unrecognizable. Romance, safety, eternal devotion. Each of these stories reflected the anxieties of its moment perfectly. Buffy, the 1990s fear of hidden evil in suburban safety. True Blood, the 2000s conversation about identity, otherness, and who deserves rights. Twilight, a generation's hunger for permanence in an increasingly unstable world. But here is what all of these stories have in common. Every single one of them moved further from the original Folklore, further from the bloated corpses in Serbian villages, further from the terrified families digging up their dead, further from the real human fear that created the vampire in the first place. Hollywood did not preserve the vampire myth. It replaced it. It took something ancient and terrifying and rebuilt it in its own image, generation after generation, until the creature on screen bore almost no resemblance to the thing that once kept entire villages awake through the night. And perhaps that tells us something important. Not just about vampires, but about stories themselves. Because every generation rewrites its monsters. Not to understand them, but to understand itself. Some stories portray vampires almost like addicts, creatures constantly fighting hunger, temptation, and self-control. Others portray them as symbols of eternal youth in a world terrified of aging. Beautiful forever. Young forever. untouched by time. And perhaps that is why vampires remain so powerful in popular culture. Because immortality is humanity's oldest fantasy. But vampire stories force us to confront the darker side of that fantasy. What would eternal life actually do to a person? What happens when you outlive everyone you have ever loved? What happens when centuries slowly strip away your humanity? The vampire offers power, freedom, eternal life. But almost every vampire story eventually reveals the same terrible truth. Living forever may not be a gift. It may be the loneliest curse imaginable. It would be easy to assume vampire beliefs disappeared long ago. That humanity left these fears behind centuries ago, along with plague villages, candlelit graveyards, and terrified mobs carrying wooden stakes through the night. But vampire beliefs never fully vanished. Even today, there are people who identify as real vampires. Some belong to small underground communities where members consume tiny amounts of human blood from willing donors. Others describe themselves as psychic vampires, claiming they feed on emotional or spiritual energy rather than blood itself. Most of these communities are harmless subcultures built around identity, fascination, ritual, and the feeling of being different from ordinary society. Many reject the Hollywood image entirely. No capes, no castles, no immortality, just people drawn to the symbolism of the vampire, the outsider, the eternal night, the hunger that never fully disappears. But in some parts of the world, older fears still survive as well. Even in the modern era, there have been reports of graves disturbed because local communities feared vampirism. In parts of Eastern Europe, old superstitions surrounding the restless dead continued far longer than many people realize. Some families still avoid certain burial customs believed to attract evil spirits. Others continue placing religious objects near graves for protection. The fear never disappeared completely. It simply became quieter. And meanwhile, the vampire itself became immortal in another way. Through stories. Through cinema. Through television, games, books, and the internet. Every new generation reinvents the creature again. Sometimes terrifying. Sometimes seductive. Sometimes tragic. But always reflecting something deeply human. That may be why the vampire survives while so many ancient monsters fade away. Because vampires adapt. They evolve alongside us. A medieval peasant feared the vampire because it represented plague and death. A modern audience fears something different. Loneliness, addiction, isolation, the loss of identity, the fear of growing old, the fear of dying before truly living. And perhaps beneath all of those fears lies something even older, something humanity has wrestled with since the beginning of history, the terrifying possibility that death may not be the end, but also the equally terrifying possibility that some part of us secretly wishes it wasn't. For thousands of years, humanity has told stories about creatures that rise from the grave. Empires collapsed. Religions changed. Science advanced. The world transformed beyond recognition. And still, the vampire survived. Perhaps because the vampire was never only about blood. It lived inside humanity's oldest fears. Fear of disease. Fear of death. Fear of the unknown waiting somewhere beyond the safety of firelight. But no matter how much the stories changed, one thing always remained the same. People continued to speak about vampires as if something real exists beneath the legend. And perhaps that is why the vampire never disappeared. Because even now, in a world ruled by science and technology, humanity still feels strangely drawn toward the idea of something that can cheat death itself. Something eternal. Something hidden. something waiting in the darkness beyond human understanding. Because no matter how modern the world becomes, no matter how brightly cities glow at night, no matter how much science explains the world around us, people still stare into the dark and wonder, what if something is staring back? What if somewhere beneath centuries of folklore, fear, and eyewitness accounts, there is truth behind the myth after all? Because in isolated villages hidden beneath mountain fog, in abandoned cemeteries where the earth has begun to sink, and in stories still whispered quietly after midnight, the question never truly disappeared. Not whether vampires are real, but whether humanity ever truly understood what people were seeing in the first place.